Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Global Industry Spotlight. My name is Daniel Crane, and I am the Director of Programming at the Center for Creative Entrepreneurship. And you are listening to a Global Industry Spotlight, a conversational series focused on providing resources and insight for the creative entrepreneur. Today, the Global Industry Spotlight is on podcaster, broadcaster, and Chicago media personality James VanOsdol. James VanOsdol's media career found him on the air and behind the scenes at some of Chicago's most celebrated radio stations. WKQX, WGN, WXRT, and WLUP. As a digital reporter, he's earned multiple Lisagor Awards in Chicago, as well as the National Edward R. Murrow Award. Podcasting since 2006. He's now entering his ninth year of hosting the celebrated hyperlocal Chicago podcast, Con Carne. James isn't always behind the podcast mic. He's also produced podcasts for Double Door, Accenture, Deloitte, and Rivet. I'm looking forward to our conversation today, so let's bring him in. Hey,
Hello.
James. How you doing?
I'm great. I love that you're doing this.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of fun. I just want to tell our listeners out there that James actually played one of the bands that I played in on I think it was Q101, but it wasn't Q101. It was QRX. What was it? What was the radio? I forgot.
KQX?
Yes, yeah.
Mhm.
And it was exciting because first of all, it was great to hear it on the radio, and I was really appreciative of you playing the track, but just kind of getting to know from that, and then now to all the things that you're doing for the podcast community, just for Chicago music scene, how supportive you've been of the local music scene. I think it's really important that we have people like you, champions of our local scene, who are bringing to light new talent and new songs. Also, honoring some of the old stuff or bringing some things that you like
Sure.
back. So it's great to have you here in the conversation, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely.
So if you don't mind, just give us a little background kind of your career up until kind of right now, and then we'll kind of talk about what you're up to now with Con Carne, and also with Chicago Podcast Day.
Sure. I mean, well, you mentioned radio. That was my background. I started at Q101 in 1993 as an intern. From there, I started working in programming. And then by 1995, I took over their local music show, which became Local 101.
Right.
I've gone on to do all sorts of things in radio. You mentioned WXRT. I was the music director there. I worked at the Loop. I did talk radio at WGN. But back in 2006, which seems crazy to say, I was fascinated by the idea of podcasting. There was a lot of stuff that I did in radio that I enjoyed in radio that I could no longer do in radio. The radio keeps getting more and more restrictive and constrictive, and podcasting was an avenue to do the things I liked in radio, have long form conversations, be interesting in a span of time that's longer than 30 seconds, or now it's really more like 12 seconds. And
Right.
for real, I mean, that is the mandate. You have to be interesting in 12 seconds, get in, get out. And I love talking to artists. I love talking to people who are doing cool and interesting things. So I threw in with podcasting very early. My first podcast was actually tied to Q101. It was a comic book interview podcast where I talked to people who create graphic novels. And from there, several years later, I joined the Steve Dahl Podcast Network. Steve Dahl, of course, iconic, legendary Radio Hall of Famer. I did an interview podcast there. And then you mentioned Con Carne, which I've been doing going on 9 years now. And I did a lot of other stuff too, but as it pertains to this conversation and entrepreneurship and the creative arts, for me, it really is all about podcasting and finding my way through that world and trying to do meaningful work there.
Yeah, and in terms of having such a rich history in media and radio, how do you see podcasting as kind of uniquely positioned today in terms of even using it as a way to break new artists or to have long form conversations? Where do you see the opportunity space?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunity to break new artists, but the ability hasn't presented itself yet.
Hmm.
Because you can't play copyrighted music on a podcast, the ability to use podcasting as a platform for artists hasn't come into its own. I think it's coming.
Right.
It doesn't exist yet. So I think that's excitement for the future. I think podcasting as audio entertainment, it's interesting, and we'll talk about Chicago Podcast Day, but traditional broadcasters have more or less ceded control of this space to amateurs.
Mm-hmm.
The barrier for entry to create a podcast is so low and so easy that lots of people have become successful on their own terms with their own visions, following their muses. And traditional broadcasters have been left in the dust. And I think they're
Right.
scrambling now to figure out, oh, we should have paid more attention. Oh, we should have thrown in earlier. So it's interesting to watch how this has evolved. I think it is a really meaningful way of expression, of communication. And that said, I don't think we're anywhere near the tipping point. I don't think podcasting is as mainstream as people want you to believe. And we will get there. But I think there's still so much yet to happen. And that makes it still feel like a really exciting moment.
Yeah, I agree, and I really appreciate the ease for an entry point for someone to start their own podcast. I think that's great, and I think it's what is important about this form that I'm very new to as well. Not like you, is that we can archive and we can document so much, right?
Yes.
And we can nerd out and we can spend time, talking about very specific things that we love or we don't love. And really it can start just as organically as like a couple of friends having a conversation,
Mm-hmm.
and then it kind of spirals into something, right? Maybe that's more meaningful or has a little momentum. So that being said, how do you can we talk a little bit about Con Carne? How do you kind of pick your guests, kind of build your following? What has been, some of the things, and then we can transition into the podcast day, but what has been some of kind of the things that you have learned along the way in building your own podcast?
So many different ways to answer that. I think
Mhm.
if you're interested in what you're doing, people will be interested. You can't fake enthusiasm. You can't fake, well, you can, but not well. You can't fake interest. And for me, it's been
Right.
about lining up people who interest me, just
Mhm.
people creating cool stuff that probably have a good story to tell. So for me, it's all been about finding people who are doing interesting things. Local musicians have been fertile ground for me. I love supporting and being part of the Chicago music community. So it's been a natural thing to bring those guests on board. But just having them be part of what I do and having them amplify what I'm creating has enabled me to do this for 9+ years or 9 years.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, it's impressive, and it's also just kind of cool to think about, your experience with traditional radio and how you were able to just see all of how that worked, right? And then or how that didn't work.
Both.
And then kind of transition into some of the things that you're doing right now. Um, and I'm always curious kind of where, you know, especially from a musician standpoint, what's going to help musicians grow their career, what's going to expand, what media is going to support
Mhm.
them, right? So and that's always kind of the question, and it's great that with podcasts you can maybe use some of that to support them.
Well, and it is tricky because, like I said, you can't play music on a podcast. You're describing songs,
Right.
you're describing aesthetics, you're describing a vibe. It's
Right.
challenging. I'm interviewing Howard Jones, 80s synth pop pioneer Howard Jones,
Right.
tomorrow on my podcast, and he's got new music out. So, how do I let the world know that Howard Jones is doing new and interesting stuff? Well, it kind of sounds like what he used to record, but it's different, and
Right.
it's tough. That's the challenge. But like I said, I think we're going to reach a point, and we're seeing different companies, different platforms making inroads to making things possible to hear music on a podcast. I think we'll get there, and I think there's a world of opportunity ahead, especially for fledgling musicians, independent artists. I think that is coming, and I think the foundation from a talk and interview perspective is being laid now.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's transition into kind of Chicago Podcast Day, which I'm looking forward to. That's happening this Saturday. Um, at 2112. So James called me and sent an email to Scott and I saying, hey, I wanted to go to this thing in LA, and it was just, the price was crazy, and it was like, I'm gonna be spending all of this money, and I just, in the lineup, it just didn't hit right. It was like, this doesn't make sense. Why don't we do it? Why don't we start something here, kind of grassroots in Chicago? And we did. We created something. So can you talk a little bit just about your initial idea behind Chicago
Mhm.
Podcast Day, and we can kind of go from there.
A lot of my ideas, whether it's a podcast, whether it's something like this event on Saturday, they all kind of spring from the same place for me. A song called "Found a Job" by Talking Heads. I love Talking Heads. It's on their More Songs About Buildings and Food album. Basically, the idea is a couple sitting at home, they're watching TV. All the TV shows suck, and they think, well, why don't we make our own shows and put them on TV? Well, why do we have to accept what we're given? Let's do something our own way. And that's kind of what Con Carne started as. And that's really the genesis of what Chicago Podcast Day is. It's become pretty much the premier podcast industry conference. And the most recent one was in Los Angeles. And I thought, well, I should probably go to one of these. There's probably good stuff to learn. And there's something to be said for networking. And when I started pricing it out, I realized, oh my God, it's going to cost anywhere between $3,000 and $5,000 to actually
Yeah.
do this, to go there, airfare, lodging, ground transport, meals, etc. And it just seemed bloated and not what I wanted to get out of something like that. And I thought, well, let's make our own thing. That's when I reached out to you and Scott. Let's do something scrappy. Let's do something
Mhm.
for Chicago because it doesn't exist right now. So the idea is a day of education, conversation, panels, instruction on how to be effective, how to be successful as a podcaster. And we're covering a lot of ground in a very short amount of time on Saturday. We're talking about things like fair use, which podcasters get wrong 9 times out of 10. We're talking about how to create a podcast from scratch. We're talking about
Right.
how to monetize a podcast, which is like the unicorn for anyone creating a podcast. We're talking about for small business, how do you create a branded podcast? We're talking about audio editing, which for people who are new to audio entertainment, audio creation, that is just a mysterious new world that you have to use YouTube tutorials to figure out. So we're going
Right.
to talk about tips and tricks there. We're trying to cover everything so that a novice can walk in and walk out feeling like they have a good head start and they're in a good space to move forward, but also so that a professional or a less amateur podcaster can walk in and get some good ideas or be inspired to try new things.
Yeah, and in the last piece, I'll add is that it's we're building community. I mean,
That's it.
it's great, right? It's like there's going to be people who are passionate about podcasts, people who have created their own podcasts, and so I'm looking forward to learning about what people are creating, what their questions are, what are some of the new things that people are thinking about. Um, can you talk a little bit about like the Chicago podcast community, just in terms of what podcasts you see out there that you like, or that have come up, or that interest you in terms of just kind of this new form?
There are so many, and I think the Chicago podcast community hasn't really coalesced yet, and I'm hoping
Yeah.
that this
Yeah.
event on Saturday is a step towards that. I mean, because let's face it, podcasting is a very solitary medium. When you
Right.
do a radio show, you go to a station, you go to a big building downtown.
Right.
Podcasting, I'm doing it in what I laughingly call my home office. You could do it
Right.
in your garage. I also do it in my car,
I
just to
know, which I
illustrate
love. I
how
love. I love
solitary it is. It'd be impossible to isolate anything, but a couple of the guests we have on Saturday, I think, are doing exemplary work. Amy Guth does the Daily Gist for Cranes, which I think is a textbook example of how to do a branded news related podcast right. She does amazing work with that. Mike Vanderbilt, who's the best bartender in Chicago, according to the readers of the Chicago Reader, he does a bunch of different horror and pop culture related podcasts, which are deep dives, which are fantastic. Chris Lanuti, Southsider, he does the Southside Pod, which is so interwoven with Southside culture. I think they had the mayor of Blue Island on the other day, and they go to local breweries. They understand how to be hyper local and part of the community. And I think there's a lot of stuff you can learn from that. There's a lot of good stuff going on. And the beauty of podcasts, as opposed to radio, is you can really pick a narrow lane and be successful at it. You don't have
Yeah.
to be broad. You don't have to think about, well, I'm talking to 500,000 people. I need to make sure it appeals to everyone. No, you can really hyper focus and be successful that way. It's long tail.
Yeah, I love that just in general too. How I think with putting any kind of content out there, you have to be successful. I'm not gonna say you have to, but to find a niche and really be laser focused on it of
For
being
sure.
like I talk about this thing. This is my thing. And with podcasting and the access, being able to create one, it's a great opportunity to start that, and to build a community around a certain niche. Um, you know, I'm looking forward to kind of talking with people who have been doing it for a while. When you kind of look online, like what are some of the tips for podcasts? A lot of it says like, well, don't stop. Don't do like 4 episodes and you don't have a lot of followers. Like you need to kind of keep it consistent and put in the work. To
That
build a little
that's
following.
That's it. I think you see a lot of people, a lot of podcasters fall off after 5 or 6 months. Like they realize, oh wait, I'm working really hard. I'm not making money off this, and I'm getting 80 downloads per episode. What's the point? I think you need to your point, just keep going. A successful author is one who finishes a book. I mean, you got to keep plugging away at it, and the finish line for podcasting is it's down the road. And if you're committing to this concept and if you're excited about this concept, you will be successful at it. You just have to keep plugging away and you have to be consistent.
Yeah, and I love the archival aspect of it too. Just that you're just building up your own story with other
Yeah.
people's stories together, right? So it's like, and that can live forever, you know.
It's
Um,
funny. A while ago, I hadn't numbered my episodes. I thought, well, that
mhm.
seems kind of vain. Like, who cares? And I put the question out there on social media. I'm like, do people really care about episode numbers? This was a couple years ago. And like 90% of the people who responded said yes. And speaking to your archival point, and I've ever since numbered every episode, and I'm really glad I did because it does kind of create that record, that catalog,
Mhm.
that inventory, and an understanding of how things have evolved and progressed. And I do love that aspect as well.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's interesting. I did the and every time I think about something right now, I forget it. But uh, at the cultural center, they had it was you went into a story pod and you interviewed like your parents or
Mhm.
somebody, and they recorded it. And I just remember how powerful it was. And then they sent you the audio. I forgot the name of it. It's like story something. Um, but that really kind of piqued my interest of like, this is such an incredible audio experience, right? To hear my father or my mother talking on a
Mhm.
microphone, at me being able to ask them questions, or a family member or whatever, like that. It's such a powerful thing. And so I'm really um you know grateful that you reached out to us to put together this Chicago Podcast Day that's happening this Saturday at 2112. It can be something where we're kind of bringing the community together. We're learning. I mean, there's just a lot of possibilities, for this day. And that being said, we're gonna kind of wrap it up. But I would love, just kind of we've talked about some tips already, but just maybe a 1, 2, 3 or a 1, 2 of, hey, I'm starting a podcast. James, what would you suggest that I do?
Well, for one, commit to it. I mean, commit to being consistent, but also allow yourself to mess up, allow yourself to fail, allow yourself to change course and audible. If something's not working or feeling right, you have the freedom, you have the flexibility to mix it up, change things. No one's holding you to anything. Take chances, make mistakes, and just be consistent. Those are the big tips I would give.
Well, fantastic. Well, there you have it, everyone. So sign up for Chicago Podcast Day happening this Saturday, May 21st, 10:30 to 5 o'clock. We have some slots open, but it is filling up, which is great. So I hope to see your faces. If you have any questions, you can email me or James. It's online. You register through Eventbrite. And we look forward to kind of building that community and hearing
Mhm.
from you. And, James, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us, this afternoon for Global Industry Spotlight. And we'll see you Saturday.
I can't wait. Thank you.
There you have it, everyone. James VanOsdol. What a great conversation. Saturday is going to be an epic event. We're going to, we're starting something new here. It might be, we might do it twice a year, but we'll see. We'll see how Saturday goes. But it's exciting to see the buzz around it. And the educational standpoint. The Center for Creative Entrepreneurship is focused on education. We want to support the creative entrepreneur, in building the thing that they want to build. So if you are building a business and you want to put a podcast around it, or you just want to build a podcast and you're trying to figure out, well, how do I make this as a little bit of revenue? These are all the kind of things that you can learn on Saturday. So with that, I'm wishing everyone a wonderful rest of the week. It's a beautiful day here in Chicago. My name is Daniel Crane. I'm the Director of Programming at the Center for Creative Entrepreneurship. And this was another episode of Global Industry Spotlight, a conversational series focused on providing resources and insight for the creative entrepreneur. Visit cceglobal.org to register for free workshops offered by our partners. Find us on Instagram and Facebook. Send us some messages. Let's connect, and we will speak with you soon. Take care.